Think of the Lion King. Remember when Simba runs away from his responsibilities and pain, trying to forget his past by adopting the Hakuna Matata motto? At first, it seems like an easy and even comfortable choice, but this escape keeps him from growing, trapping him in a life that isn't truly his. This is a form of emotional weakness that Nietzsche despised, not because it's weak in a physical sense, but because it represents a lack of honesty with oneself, a self-deception that limits life. To Nietzsche, emotional weakness wasn't just about feeling vulnerable. Above all, it was a refusal to face one's own truths, an escape from what truly challenges us. And here comes the question, how often do we, too, hide behind a comforting idea, like Simba, trying to forget what hurts? In this video, we'll explore why Nietzsche despised this kind of emotional weakness and how he believed true strength lies in facing our own shadows. Get ready for a perspective that might challenge the way you see your emotions and attitudes. To Nietzsche, emotional weakness was much more than simple vulnerability. It was an inability to be truthful with oneself. This lack of inner honesty leads us to create a false image, both for others and for ourselves. When we don't know ourselves deeply, we end up hiding behind layers of self-deception. It's like living in a kind of theater, where we play roles we think are acceptable, but that actually distance us from our essence. Nietzsche saw this self-deception as a form of escape, a way to avoid facing uncomfortable truths about who we really are. Imagine someone who insists they're fine, even when everything indicates otherwise. They smile, say everything's under control, but inside, they feel overwhelmed by feelings they'd rather ignore. This behavior is a way to seek security, but at the same time, it traps them in a superficial, unsatisfying life. For Nietzsche, self-knowledge is the foundation of all true strength. He believed that those who lack the courage to look within end up creating a false sense of security, a protection that limits their own growth without confronting our weaknesses. How can we expect to overcome them? This kind of dishonesty with oneself creates an invisible barrier that blocks personal development and ultimately causes suffering. Nietzsche saw compassion from a different and even provocative perspective. For him, true compassion is the kind that strengthens the other person, encouraging them to find their own strength. However, there's another side to empathy, a manipulative compassion that, instead of helping, ends up creating dependence. This type of kindness keeps the other person in a state of weakness, preventing them from developing autonomy. Nietzsche criticized relationships where the help offered was actually a way to seek control or recognition. It's like that person who always offers support, but in doing so, expects the other to remain dependent, needing them to handle their difficulties. This kind of compassion may appear altruistic on the surface, but deep down, it limits the other's growth. Instead of encouraging autonomy, it subtly weakens them. For Nietzsche, true magnanimity isn't about offering help to keep someone in a position of inferiority, but rather inspiring them to find their own strength. He preferred a kind of compassion that, instead of creating dependency, reinforces the other person's self-sufficiency by valuing autonomy. This authentic compassion encourages growth and self-knowledge, allowing the person to become emotionally more resilient. And it's along these lines of thought that Nietzsche introduces another profound concept: resentment. Just as manipulative compassion can entrap, resentment is a poison fueled by repressed desires. And over time, it prevents a person from being truly honest with themselves and others. Nietzsche saw resentment as an emotional prison that corrodes a person from the inside out. For him, resentment arises when we suppress our desires, and instead of acknowledging them, start devaluing what we cannot achieve. It's a cycle that begins with unexpressed pain and turns into self-deception. The person tells themselves they don't care, or that it doesn't matter, when in reality, they still secretly harbor that desire. According to Nietzsche, this cycle of resentment leads to disdain for others, especially for those who achieve what we could not. Imagine a person who dreamed of succeeding in a particular field, but upon seeing others accomplish what they couldn't, starts to scorn those individuals, convincing themselves that they don't deserve it, or that it's not that important. Instead of dealing with what they truly feel, this person camouflages their frustration, creating a kind of emotional shield that keeps them stuck. To Nietzsche, Resentment is a trap that perpetuates emotional weakness. When someone surrenders to this cycle, they distance themselves from their own truth, and rather than facing their weaknesses and limitations, they find excuses to remain in their current state. This continual self-deception is one of the greatest barriers to personal growth, as it keeps us locked in a distorted view of ourselves and others. But what did Nietzsche propose as an alternative to this reactive stance? He believed that genuine strength begins with facing one's own truth, building a solid foundation that goes beyond superficial appearances. For Nietzsche, true strength isn't about appearing invulnerable or striving to please others, but rather something much deeper, the courage to face one's own truth. Authentic strength, according to him, comes from self-knowledge and the ability to acknowledge our weaknesses, to then transform them into a solid foundation for growth. Unlike superficial strength, which seeks external approval, authentic strength is supported by an inner determination and a commitment to be honest with oneself. Nietzsche distinguished this genuine strength from the kind that's merely a mask, a way to appear invincible while, on the inside, a person may be filled with insecurities. To him, true strength involves a kind of courage that many avoid, the courage to question oneself, to challenge one's own limitations and fears. This strength doesn't rely on applause, but rather on the confidence of knowing who you truly are, free from labels or others' expectations. When we pursue this authenticity, we break free from the constant need for approval and validation. We start acting based on internal values and build an emotional resilience that doesn't crumble at the first sign of criticism or disapproval. And it's this kind of strength, Nietzsche argued, that prepares us to face life in a genuine way, without illusions. But for this strength to be sustained, something more is needed, a well-organized will that guides us and shields us from emptiness and nihilism. Challenges Nietzsche saw as constant dangers for anyone who hasn't developed a clear purpose. For Nietzsche, living authentically wasn't just about strength, it was also about purpose. He believed that an organized will is essential to avoiding nihilism, that existential void that arises when life loses its meaning, when we're confused or lack direction. It's easy to fall into apathy, living in a shallow way and without a true connection to our own choices. Nietzsche saw this as one of the greatest threats to human fulfillment. Organizing the will involves having clarity about what we seek and directing our energies to overcome personal challenges, instead of passively reacting to circumstances. Nietzsche invites us to set our own goals, to develop a vision of life that is authentic and meaningful. This focus isn't only a path to external achievements, but also an anchor that keeps us from getting lost in doubts and uncertainties. When we have this clarity, we avoid the risk of nihilism because our life gains a structured purpose, a reason to persist even through difficult times. Instead of succumbing to despair or a lack of meaning, we cultivate an inner strength that supports our choices, and in doing so, we come closer to a deeper acceptance of life as it is, a concept Nietzsche defined as amor fati, or love of fate. The concept of amor fati, or love of fate, is one of Nietzsche's most impactful ideas. He encourages us not only to accept life's circumstances, but to love them, including the challenges, struggles, and disappointments. For Nietzsche, it is in the acceptance of everything that happens, from pleasure to pain, that we find a source of strength and self-overcoming. This love of fate isn't passive resignation, but an active stance of valuing life in its entirety. Imagine difficulties as pieces of a puzzle that make us stronger. Instead of rejecting or resisting what we can't control, Nietzsche suggests that we embrace these experiences as opportunities to grow. It's as if every obstacle becomes a lesson that takes us to a deeper level of self-knowledge and resilience. This mindset allows a person to step out of the role of victim and into the role of creator of their own destiny. This amor fati is the opposite of escapism and self-deception. It's a radical acceptance that strengthens the spirit and prepares us for the challenges still to come. Through this, we come closer to the ideal of the Übermensch, or Superman, a concept Nietzsche uses to describe someone who creates their own values and strives for constant self-improvement. Independent of social conventions, the concept of the Übermensch, or Superman, is one of Nietzsche's core ideas for human development. Unlike what many think, the Übermensch is not a figure of physical strength or dominance over others, but someone who transcends the limitations imposed by society and creates their own values. Nietzsche saw this ideal as a person who is continually pursuing self-development, establishing their own standards of conduct, and freeing themselves from the expectations of others. The Übermensch is dedicated to continuous growth, without being bound by social conventions or behavior patterns that don't align with their true nature. This figure represents freedom of spirit, the ability to act according to one's convictions, regardless of external pressures. This ideal invites us to question the extent to which we are shaping our lives according to our own values, or merely following established norms. Nietzsche's view goes beyond the pursuit of status or approval. It's about living authentically, creating a unique path that reflects who we truly are. And within this process arises an important reflection. Could it be that our emotional weaknesses and the judgments we make about others are, ultimately, barriers to reaching this ideal of autonomous development? Nietzsche believed that judgment of others often reflects our own emotional weaknesses. When we judge, it's as if we are projecting our insecurities and dissatisfactions onto others. According to him, the impulse to judge comes from personal dissatisfaction, an echo of resentment and inner dishonesty. Rather than acknowledging our own limitations and working to overcome them, excessive judgment keeps us trapped in a cycle of self-sabotage, preventing genuine growth. This critique of judgment leads us to ask, why do we so often prefer to assess others' behavior instead of focusing on our own growth? For Nietzsche, judgment is a way to distract ourselves from what really matters. Self-knowledge. When we're busy criticizing others, we avoid looking at our own weaknesses and delay confronting our limitations. This behavior doesn't make us stronger. On the contrary, it reinforces the very barriers that prevent us from reaching the ideal of emotional self-sufficiency. This ideal of independence and emotional self-sufficiency that Nietzsche championed requires us to look within and face our weaknesses, rather than projecting them onto those around us. And here is where the will to power comes in, a force within that he saw as essential for overcoming these limitations and directing life with meaning. For Nietzsche, the will to power was a fundamental force, an inner energy that drives humans to transcend their limitations. Rather than a quest for power over others, the will to power represents a constant struggle for inner growth and self-transformation. According to Nietzsche, this force is the foundation for transcending our emotional weaknesses and living a more meaningful, fulfilling life. This will to power is what drives us to face our fears, challenge our insecurities, and take control of our own life's direction. Nietzsche believed that by focusing on this inner force, we become less dependent on external opinions and validation, building a life guided by a personal purpose. This will to power helps us transform weaknesses into learning experiences, and through this, to build a more authentic and resilient version of ourselves. This process of transformation is not simple, but it's essential for anyone who seeks to live with integrity. Nietzsche saw this path as an act of courage, an active choice for growth and autonomy. And for this emotional autonomy to solidify, it's necessary to find a balance between independence and the relationships we cultivate, a crucial theme in the pursuit of emotional self-sufficiency. Nietzsche believed that true emotional strength lies in self-sufficiency, in the ability to be emotionally independent without isolating ourselves from the world. For him, the ideal is to find a balance where our relationships are enriching, but not essential to our stability. In this sense, emotional self-sufficiency doesn't mean cutting ties or avoiding connections, but rather building a solid internal foundation that allows us to live and love freely. This balance is challenging, as we often confuse the need for connection with emotional dependence. When we become overly dependent, we project our own insecurities and expectations onto our relationships, hoping that the other person will complete us or fill a void that, in reality, is ours to address. Nietzsche saw this dependence as a form of limitation, as it prevents us from growing autonomously and keeps us trapped in a cycle of constant search for validation. Emotional self-sufficiency, then, is a state where we can be in relationships without letting them define who we are. By cultivating this independence, We become freer to build relationships based on choice and mutual respect rather than need. This balance between autonomy and connection allows us to live with greater intensity and truth, completing Nietzsche's vision of emotional strength. Nietzsche challenges us to see emotional weakness not as a lack of physical strength, but as an inability to be truthful with ourselves. He criticized the masks of self-deception, the cycle of resentment, and the absence of an organized will, seeing all these as barriers to our own growth. For him, true emotional strength is not merely about resilience, but a way of life, a deep and conscious commitment to brutal honesty and independence of spirit. And here comes the provocation. Are you truly honest with yourself? To what extent do you confront your own limitations? Or do you prefer the comfort of illusions that shield you from pain? Nietzsche believed that this courage to look inward is essential. So, why not ask yourself, do you have the strength to let go of the justifications that hold back your growth? This reflection might be uncomfortable, but it's also transformative. If anything here resonated with you, feel free to share in the comments. Do you agree with Nietzsche? Do you believe emotional weakness is a form of dishonesty? Or do you see room for vulnerability? In the end, Nietzsche challenges us to live intensely, to be strong on our own terms, to see life as something we create ourselves, free from limiting conventions. Are you ready to accept this challenge? It may be a solitary path, but it leads us to discover what is most authentic within each of us.